This is Professor Bataille, and today we will take a second look at international trade. In another video that I recorded for your benefit, we determined that countries that imported benefited from importation, and that countries that exported benefited from exports. The country that imported benefited from being able to purchase a variety of goods at a lower price. And the country that exported was able to produce more, hence hire more workers and generate more profits by exporting. Of course, it was easy to determine that international trade benefited both countries as the proverbial pie became larger. Still, there are reasons that can justify restricting trade. Today, we will look at some of them. First trade restriction that is most often used is tariffs. Tariffs are simply a tax that is placed on a good that enters a country. Quotas are a limit on the number of goods that are allowed inside a country. Quotas will work as tariffs do, giving in the end the same exact price and quantity sold within a country. And so we'll focus more on tariffs today. There are other trade barriers that we will discuss towards the end of our lecture. Finally, export subsidies work in the opposite manner in which tariffs do. Countries sometimes provide some of their manufacturers with subsidy to help in the production of goods that will be exported. And now, let's take a practical application of tariff to demonstrate how a country could limit the entrance on its territory of goods. Remember the example that we took from that other video lecture where the US was importing t-shirts? US manufacturers originally produced t-shirts for $8, but after the country allowed for international trade, t-shirts were now sold at $5. For that price, US consumers were able to purchase 60 million t-shirts. 40 million of them were being imported from China, and 20 million of them were being produced in the United States. Let's now assume that the United States decides to restrict imports of t-shirts in order to protect, let's say, its local workforce that is working in the manufacturing of t-shirts. Let's say that the US imposes a $2 tariff on every t-shirt that comes into the country from China. The price of t-shirts in the United States will now be of $7. Because t-shirts are more expensive, US consumers will purchase less t-shirts. They will purchase 45 million t-shirts. And because t-shirts are more expensive, more US firms will be competitive and they will be able to produce 35 million t-shirts. Hence, we will still import 10 million t-shirts from China, but that is far less than the 40 million t-shirts that we use to import. Also, what is important here is since there is a tariff of $2 per t-shirt and that 10 million t-shirts are imported, the US government will generate a tariff revenue of $20 million. If we take a closer look at the graph that explains tariff, we understand that a few things happen when tariffs were imposed. First, less US consumers were able to purchase t-shirts because they became more expensive. Second, more US manufacturers were able to produce t-shirts because they were now able to compete. Nevertheless, we didn't completely stop importations of t-shirts from China. We must now analyze whether we won or lost from imposing tariffs. To do this, we must look at the consumer and the producer's surplus analysis. We will look at the graph that shows consumer and producer surplus after trade has been allowed. We see that producer surplus with trade but without tariff is represented by area A. Consumer surplus with trade but without tariff is represented by all of the other areas that you can see on the graph. B, C, D, E, X, and Y. But once tariffs are imposed and the price of t-shirt increases from $5 to $7, consumers lose areas B, C, D, and E, and consumer surplus is only represented by areas X and Y. We are not too worried that the consumers lost areas B because that area went to the producers who gained. Also, area D went to the government as it represents the revenue generated by this tariff. Unfortunately, areas C and E disappeared. This is the deadweight loss from tariff. And this is why society will lose in the end, as the losses from the losers, which in this case are the consumers, will be greater than the gains from the producers and the US government combined. This is because consumers now have to pay a higher price, and so fewer of them are able to purchase t-shirts. And yes, US producers did win because they can produce more t-shirts. But they did not win as much as many who support trade restrictions would believe. Still, there are some valid and less valid arguments for trade restrictions. Let's look at a few of them. We will begin by valid economic arguments for trade restrictions. Dumping occurs when a country sells a good that it produces below cost. This is illegal, and so imposing tariffs to prevent dumping would be justified. Also, we sometimes have health, safety, or other concerns with goods that are imported. They might not have the same high standard that we have and might be dangerous. And so it would be valid to restrict trade in such occurrences. Economically, there is a more intricate justification for the restriction of trade. Infant industries need to be protected as they are growing, much as a child needs protection as he or she is developing. And so, some countries that want to protect their infant industry decide to temporarily impose restrictions on trade just as long as their industry grows. Some of the countries that have successfully done so and have learned by doing, meaning they've produced goods, protected their infant industry, allowed that industry to grow and to learn as it was producing, include China and South Korea. But determining which industry needs to be protected is very difficult. Other arguments have been proposed to restrict tariff. These are not valid. Some have proposed that tariffs should be imposed to reduce outsourcing, to save domestic jobs, or to prevent competition from cheap foreign labor. Although we would like for all of our industries to be competitive and for none of them to outsource so that we do not lose local jobs, industries that are penalized by goods coming into our country are industries that are less efficient and have higher production costs. And so, it might not be wise to protect these industries at the expense of vastly more efficient local industries. Remember, if we restrict goods coming into our country by imposing tariffs, it is likely that the other country will do the same. Hence, our industries that are extremely competitive, so much so that they can export worldwide, would be penalized once we impose tariff on another country, and that country would respond by imposing tariffs of their own. The same argument can be used to defeat the argument that wants to protect our labor from cheap foreign labor. Labor is cheap in other countries, mostly because these countries have not reached our level of development and are not as rich as we are. Hence, we do not want to have a labor that is as cheap as in other countries. We actually want to have a well-paid labor that can work in highly efficient industries, the same industries that export. And so, instead of trying to compete with cheap foreign labor, we should increase our level of technology and our human capital and take advantage of our highly efficient labor force. There are other arguments for trade restrictions. These are normative arguments. It cannot be determined exactly whether they are valid or non-valid. The truth is in the eyes of the beholder. For example, some have suggested that we impose tariffs on other countries that mistreat their labor or their population. This could be a valid argument. It would not help our economy, but it might make these other countries treat their population and their labor force better. Also, others have suggested that we impose trade restrictions on countries that do not follow environmental laws. This would also create an incentive for these countries to respect international environmental laws. Finally, some believe that the trade from more developed countries to less developed countries overly benefits the developed countries, but also penalizes the developing countries. This theory has not been proven to be true, but there are some instances when, if we would self-restrict trade, we could help some developing countries. And so, if there are so few reasons to restrict trade, but we've learned in another video that trade is beneficial to each and both countries, even though there are some winners and losers in each country, why is there so much talk about trade restriction? Mostly, some lobbying groups who are defending the interests of some industries that are losing from trade push this agenda. Political opportunism also contributes as politicians cater to these lobbies. But again, to summarize, there are no valid economic rationale to restrict trade. This concludes our lecture. Goodbye.